This presentation is part of the Preparing for the Time of Trouble series found at preparingforthetimeoftroubles.com. There you'll find online videos, podcasts, and handouts, all of them for free. The standard definition of off-grid has to do with not being connected to the electrical grid, as seen by this rustic cabin in the woods with solar panels on the roof. The power grid is a complicated and large production that is power generating stations, which can be hydroelectric, it can be wind, it could be solar. And these commercial ventures then run through substations and different transfer stations to run the power to your individual homes. Of course, this requires paying for being connected to the grid as well as a monthly bill. Now, if you're considering being off-grid from the electrical grid, there have been various studies done, and this one was research done by Off-Grid Permaculture. Daniel Mark Schwartz came up with this priority list based on various criteria about which states in the United States are the most favorable to living off the power grid. The top winner is Alabama with a score of 9.8, Missouri number 2, and down through the list, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Louisiana, Indiana, Hawaii, Colorado, and Arkansas. This chart shows a breakdown of how those same states were prioritized. It was a mixture of various issues having to do with having the feasibility of living remotely and without being connected up. These overall scores were a combination of the cost of where it is to live. You can see that Alabama is one of those that the cost of living is different than other states. Freedom of movement. You can see that there is less freedom in Hawaii and Arkansas than there is in Alabama and Missouri and Georgia, for instance. The availability of water, the availability of growing food, that can have to do with the region and the sun and water and different aspects having to do with gardening. Energy and community. Community is an interesting one because Missouri, you can see, is better for being with like-minded people than apparently Alabama. Now, being off-grid, on the other hand, you can get power generation on your property in a variety of ways. The most efficient, cost-effective, and popular method is solar. This chart shows the world and the different areas that are conducive to solar gain, it's called. You can see on the line at the bottom of this chart, and this came from globalsolaratlas.info, they have individual charts for different regions of the country, if you want to go look there. But you can see on the chart, the line at the bottom, that the upper part is the daily totals of kilowatt hours per square meter. A meter is roughly 3 feet, so that's 9 square feet of solar generating panel. So basically, to make it a rough example, it would be per panel. So your daily total in the regions that are red would be 6.2 kilowatt hours generated in a 24-hour period with one panel, if I'm reading this chart correctly. And therefore, in the red areas, the yearly totals would be 2,200 kilowatt hours per panel per year. Now, you can see as you get further away from those red areas that the numbers drop significantly. So if you are in southern Canada, let's say, you would be yellow. And so rather than creating 2,200 kilowatts of power per panel per year, you would have almost half of that. So the amount of solar gain depends on where you live. Obviously, you have to be facing south to be able to see the sun. And of course, if you live in the southern hemisphere, you have to look north. This is another chart by the same people, a World Bank group that is, and it's showing the United States in particular, but they have other areas as well. If you look at the lower right corner, this shows in the green the amount of solar gain per month. So you can see the obvious that in the summer, when the sun is more direct, that there is more solar gain for solar panels and for gardening than there is in the winter. And of course, that would also apply if you were in the southern hemisphere. You would get more solar gain when the sun is more direct than when it's off in the horizon. The one thing I wanted to point out from this chart is the electrical consumption per capita in the United States is almost 13,000 kilowatt hours of power a year. So that's pretty significant, because if you're going to design your own solar system to be off grid, you're going to want to calculate, first of all, how much power you're going to want to maintain your lifestyle. I would recommend, if you want to get very educated on this subject, you look up Off-Grid Boot Camp on the internet, and you can subscribe to you can watch some free videos, but also subscribe to their whole complete Off-Grid Boot Camp program to get fully educated. Also, if you go to backwoodssolar.com, this company sells equipment for solar and hydro and things like that for generating power off grid, and that you can download or request their free catalog, which part of that catalog is a very good explanation of the theory and the concepts of generating power off grid. So I highly recommend getting that, and if you're serious about it, check out the Off-Grid Bootcamp. Here is a sun index. The Washington state is at the top of the list, and that is the least sun index, whereas the bottom is Nevada. Nevada is, and Arizona and New Mexico get the most sun around the year. So another way of getting electricity off grid is the wind. Most of us have seen pictures of or seen the big commercial wind generators, but you can purchase and install residential size windmills. The thing that I would caution you about that compared to solar is that solar basically has no moving parts, and they last a long time. A wind generator is a mechanical device. It's in the wind, it's rotating, it's spinning, it's got blades, it's got a generator up on the pole, it's up in the air, it might be 80 feet in the air. And so there's quite a bit of mechanical cost and maintenance of a wind generator. I know of two friends of mine that had wind generators at the time, and in both cases they had to repair their wind generators when I knew of them. And that could be expensive, it could be dangerous. The other issue is, do you have enough wind to make it practical? And what I was told is that if you have enough wind, you're cursing at the wind. And if you don't have enough wind, you're cursing at your equipment. So basically, you're going to be the ability to generate wind power is based on having enough wind that it's really quite uncomfortable to live there. And you do need approximately, for a residential size wind generator, you need a consistent 8 miles an hour wind or more to just start generating power. And that's not generating the amount of power that the wind generator is designed for and advertised to be able to produce. So at eight miles an hour, you are just starting to generate power. You might need 15 or 20 miles an hour to actually produce the full capacity of the wind generator. Here is a chart showing wind availability by state. Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota are top of the list, and Wyoming is the bottom of the list of the top 10. So there again, that's a whole state, and so it depends where you are in the state, whether you're going to be in a position to generate enough electricity to make it worth considering. A third method of generating electricity is microhydro. A lot of dams on rivers in the United States, for instance, particularly in the western United States, are dams that produce electricity in high volume. They are hydroelectric dams. What we're talking about here is for your own personal dam, not necessarily dam, but your own personal water generating system. That's called a microhydro because it's not a big scale operation, even though microhydro can be more expensive than one might think. In this case, there looks like about a 4-inch pipe coming down a hill, going into this turbine called a Pelton wheel, and spinning and generating power off the generator, which is on the top of this picture. And you can see how much water it's taking for that process to happen. And here again, in order to produce microhydro of any useful amount, you would need to have water that is coming downhill, possibly 100 vertical feet, which is called head, 100 feet of drop coming down through the pipe. And as it goes down further, it makes more pressure. So by the time it drops that 100 feet, it's got quite a bit of pressure, as you can see from this picture. If you're on property that is flat and has a creek ambling through there, it may very well be that you can't generate electricity practically in a microhydro environment. Here's a map of the United States showing existing hydroelectric plants. These would be commercial ones, or potential high head. There you go, 100 feet high. Low power, that would be you on your property. So high head, low power energy sites could be where you would have your own power generating with hydro. And you'll see that the existing hydroelectrics is in the yellow, and exclusion areas are important because the purple are areas where you would not be allowed to do hydro. I have to kind of chuckle because I'm looking at Florida. I understand the highest point on the state of Florida is 75 feet, so I don't see how you would generate hydro in Florida anyway. So the question is it legal to live off grid, to be disconnected from the power company and generate your own electricity? According to research done by Daniel Mark Schwartz, there are no states that specifically outlaw off-grid living. However, you will have to connect with water rights and building permits to live off-grid legally. The freest states for off-grid living are Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Missouri, Indiana, Maine, and Texas, according to Daniel. So the point of this presentation is off-grid is more than being off the electrical grid. In my opinion, it's being independent of all of the systems that you would normally purchase. So one thing to consider is freedom. If you live in an area where you have freedom of being able to do what you want without having to get building permits, following building codes and regulations, then that may be advantageous. That may be something that you're looking for. On the other hand, it's important to consider, I believe, the resale value. So if you were to build and develop a property and did not have to get permits for anything, then that's great until you go to sell. And even though at the time you sell, it may still not be required to have permits. If the buyer is going to borrow money from a bank to purchase your property, they may not be able to until you have permits. I know of one person who had property in a place where permits were not required, and they went to sell their place, and the bank would not loan it without getting a permit for the septic that was already in the ground. So this friend of mine had to dig up the septic drain field and be able to show to the inspector that it was done according to code. Then he got the permit with great pain and inconvenience and was able to sell the property. So the top states again for being off grid, top of the 10 is Alabama, and the bottom one is Idaho. They are all good places to be off grid because there are 50 states, and these are the top dozen or so. So, what other kinds of grids are there? Well, besides the power grid, we have a water grid. Remember, we're talking about something that you are purchasing to connect your living space to the service. So the power grid, water grid, heat grid, food supply grid, information grid, financial grid, medical grid, and education grid. There may be others, but those are the ones we're going to focus on here. So the power grid is, like we said, was a network of power lines that bring power to your home from the power generating stations and provide you with that service. But you have to pay to hook up to it, and you have to pay monthly bills. And if you're trying to be disconnected from the services of the world, then you want to avoid that possibly. So the ways to do that, as we discussed, would be generating your own power, which can be done with solar and wind and microhydro. More than likely, it would just be solar. Solar is comparatively cheap enough, doesn't have moving parts, that if you, rather than these other alternative ways, you could just generate it all with adding more solar panels is a possibility. The next one is the water grid. You've all seen these kinds of water tanks in municipal areas. They have wells or other water processing facilities that maybe take river water and turn it into potable, drinkable water by adding chlorine and things like that. They pump it up into this tower. You can see the pipe, and then gravity brings it back down and pushes it into the various homes. But one way to do it is rainwater harvest. You could collect your own water. You could also have a well if you have the ability to generate enough electricity to run the pump. But rainwater, let's take a look at that. Basically, you gather the water off your roof, put it in a tank, and use it from the tank. That method of getting off the water grid was rated, and you can see from this chart that Hawaii is the top of this chart and North Carolina is the bottom. You'll also notice in the second column whether it's unrestricted use or whether it's illegal or legal. And these are all legal or unrestricted because it's the top of the list. There could very well be parts of the country or the world where regulations don't allow you to gather the water uh, for this kind of purpose. You'll also notice the annual rainfall inches. Uh, the reason that Hawaii is high on the list is because they get quite a bit of rain. We think of Hawaii as being beautiful and sunny and 90 degrees. Well, it's not uncommon to have a rainstorm in the afternoon for 20 minutes and then go away. And so the annual rainfall is the key factor. The next grid is heat. This is a residential furnace. It runs off of electricity or natural gas or propane. In this case, it looks like it's probably natural gas, not sure, but it's quite a bit of mechanical stuff, and you've got to purchase your fuel, whether it's natural gas or propane or electricity, in order to have the supply to heat your home. So one way to do it where you're off grid is to heat with wood. That means on your property you need to have enough materials, trees, to be able to keep your own firewood supply routinely year after year. And it requires an effort on your part to knock down the trees, cut the firewood, split it, and stack it. And you need to have the firewood under a roof and be stored potentially a year ahead of time to dry out thoroughly before you use it. If you rush on that, you can end up with building up creosote in your chimney and having a fire. So you need to have dry wood stored in a dry place.
One of the very important things if you're going to live out in the country, unless you've got a place that is warm all year long, you're going to have some cold weather, you need firewood. Boy, it's really nice to have a good wood cook stove, and you can't beat when it's cold and wet outside to sit by a glow of a cozy fire and pluck the guitar.
The next grid is food supply. We've all experienced, I'm sure, times when you go to purchase your food supplies at the grocery store, or maybe it's toilet paper during a pandemic, and the shelves are bare. So what happens if the transportation system breaks down? What if there's an EMP and the power grid goes down? All of a sudden your source of food is now dried up and you're in trouble. So one of the advantages of being off grid is not be dependent on that system, the food supply grid. So here is an example of a home garden with greenhouse and various vegetables being grown. And if you preserve them you could live year round off of your own property. Then there's the information grid. We all are addicted, if you will, to the services of the internet, to cell phone services and so forth. But what if you're living far remote? How would you be able to connect to that method of communicating and getting information? One way is you can get some service. You would still have to pay for it, where you could connect by line of sight or through satellite to be able to get connected to the world. But you wouldn't have to be hardwired like you would if you were in town with the DSL or cable. Then we have the financial grid. What if all of a sudden you didn't have the ability to access your money? We've seen that in war-torn areas where people run to the ATMs and they can't get money. We've seen it in the States where they are limiting at credit unions how much you can take out at a time. We also have the limitations if you're traveling on a plane across international lines. You're not allowed to take more than $10,000 with you physically, even if it's cash. So we're very dependent on the financial grid. So what do you do about that in a time when you want to be self-sustaining, or maybe when you can't buy or sell at all? Well, one thing is you get out of debt. And this is a homestead that I saw on the internet. You could take these words and Google it and find it. This couple lives debt-free in their $7,000 do-it-yourself off-grid home. So they are living within their means, and they're being proactive in trying to be debt-free and very frugal. That might mean that you're giving up your large, spacious home that you're used to with all the conveniences of grocery stores and transportation, and now you're living within your means and living very frugally and being debt-free. If you're debt-free, then when the financial grid goes down, it doesn't really matter to you. Another thing to consider in regards to the financial grid is the cost of land and taxes. Now, we have talked in other presentations and preparing for the timeoftrouble.com about the prediction prophetically that from the Bible that there's going to be a time, if you're faithful to God, that you're not going to be able to buy or sell at all. And the question has been raised to me, what do you do if you're debt free and you're self-sustaining? You still have land taxes to pay for. Well, I suppose one way is you could squat on some government land out in the boondocks, but assuming you have your own property and you're debt free and you're self-sustaining, you still have the cost of taxes. So here's a breakdown of the cheapest states to live off grid in terms of property tax. And it looks to me like the property tax is the cheapest in Louisiana, but the cost of living, the cost of purchasing the land is higher. So if you own the land and you're debt free, then it looks like Louisiana would be the top of the list. But still, you have land taxes. So um, the conclusion that I've come to with advice from some other people is that at least in some states in the United States, um, when you don't pay your taxes, they will eventually put your property up for sale on a tax auction. And the highest bidder gets your land for the price that you owe on taxes. So if you were debt free and you owned a property that was worth, say, $100,000, but you couldn't pay your taxes, they could take it away from you without paying you anything. And the buyer would get it just for the taxes that you owed, which may just be a few $1,000s. So what do you do when you can't buy or sell? Well, number one, the Bible says there will be a time when you have to flee to the mountains and leave it all behind. But in the meantime, in what we call the little time of trouble, if you can't buy or sell because you're faithful to God and aren't taking the mark of the beast, but you still own your property and you still live at your place and God hasn't guided you to leave yet, um, in some states in the United States, they will not take your home and put it on the auction block for 2 years. So if when you see the clouds coming, the mark of the beast is threatening and knocking at the door, if you can pay your taxes for the next year, and in some places you can pay up to 3 years, but if you can pay up for a year, then the clock doesn't even start ticking for a year. Then when it does, it ticks for, say, 2 years. That means you have a 3-year window when they will not take your house away from you. So just something to think about. But it looks to me that if you made all efforts to be completely self-sustaining, the only remaining cost would be paying property tax. Then we have the medical grid. We're all dependent on medical services, which many times require insurance or out of pocket and professional people in professional facilities taking care of you. But what do you do to be completely off grid? Say you're in the stage of the little time of trouble when you can't buy or sell. Now what? Well, we have counsel that medical missionary evangelism will be very important in that time. And that's because not only may you not have the ability to afford medical facilities, but so will many other people. And this will be an opportunity for those who have trained themselves in alternative medicine and natural remedies and hydrotherapy and things like that to be able to help their neighbors and friends and themselves in a time when you and maybe they can't get medical attention from a traditional medical facility in the medical grid. And then last of all is the education grid. We've got public schools, we've got private schools, parochial schools, Christian education. All of them are group uh, situations where children go and spend time in classrooms together. And if you can't, if you're going to be completely off grid in all of these areas, then obviously the way that you could solve that is by homeschooling. That does require a commitment on the part of the parents. There is some financial obligation to have the materials, but homeschooling is a very viable way to get off of the education grid.
Knowing these things about country living and having some food stored away and being able to live off the grid, it's not going to save anyone. We're not going to be saved by Pelton wheels and solar panels. The only thing that's going to save us in the last days is a relationship with Jesus. You could be in the middle of a city, and with Jesus, you're a lot safer than being out in the country without Christ.
So remember, as you contemplate these things and possibly lay down plans for you to become more independent from the systems of the world, that you don't need to get discouraged. You don't need to be overwhelmed. Baby steps, one thing at a time. The Bible promises in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.